The church was glowing that afternoon, sunlight pouring through stained glass and scattering colors across the polished floor. My son Daniel stood at the altar in his navy suit, nervous but proud, the boy I'd raised now on the edge of becoming a husband. The air smelled faintly of lilies, the organ hummed softly, and every guest seemed suspended in a kind of reverence. For a moment, I let myself breathe. After all the planning, the arguments over table settings and guest lists, this day was supposed to be about joy. I adjusted my pearl bracelet, the one my late mother had given me, and glanced around at the familiar faces. Neighbors, cousins, old friends from work. Everyone was smiling, waiting for the bride to walk down the aisle. And when she finally appeared, veiled and radiant in her lace gown, a hush fell over the room. I wanted to feel relief, pride, something simple. Instead, a tightness gathered in my chest, the kind I'd been carrying for weeks. Something about the way she moved, hesitant like she was dragging chains invisible to everyone but me, made me sit straighter in my pew. The vows began, the pastor's voice steady, guiding them through the ritual words. Daniel's voice cracked with emotion as he promised to love her for better or worse. The bride's hands trembled as she held his. I thought it was nerves, the kind all brides carry on their wedding day. But then she froze. Right there in front of God and everyone, she let go of my son's hands. Her chest heaved like she was fighting for air. Then, in one sharp movement, she tore off her veil. Gasps rippled through the pews as the lace fluttered to the floor. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat, her eyes wild as they locked onto mine. "Tell them," she cried, her voice breaking but loud enough to echo against the church rafters. "Tell them the truth." The room erupted. Guests whispered in confusion. Daniel's mouth hung open, his bouquet of words stolen from him. I sat frozen, my spine rigid against the wooden pew, my heart hammering in my ears. "Tell them the truth." She was pointing at me. Not Daniel, not the pastor. Me. My throat closed. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into me, waiting for me to rise and explain. But what would I say? That I'd seen the shadows in her eyes weeks ago, that I had guessed something terrible was festering beneath her polished smile. That part of me already knew this moment was coming and chose silence anyway? I lowered my gaze to the floor. Silence was safer. Silence was the only thing I had left to protect Daniel from whatever storm she was trying to unleash. But she wasn't done. Her breath came ragged, her knees buckled beneath her gown, and she crumpled to the ground in front of the altar. A shriek went up from her maid of honor. Daniel dropped beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to lift her. "Somebody call for help!" he yelled, his voice ragged with panic. The organ cut off mid-note. Guests scrambled from the pews, half rushing forward, half stepping back in fear. The pastor knelt, pressing a hand to her shoulder, whispering prayers. I stayed seated, nails digging crescents into my palms, staring at the veil on the floor. My son looked up at me then, his eyes wide, pleading, desperate for answers I couldn't give. The room had become a blur of movement and noise, but between us stretched a silence louder than the chaos. And then the church doors groaned. Everyone turned as the heavy oak doors creaked open. Sunlight spilled across the aisle, framing a figure standing there. Someone I hadn't seen in years, someone whose presence alone sent ice straight through my veins. Gasps rippled again, sharper this time as recognition spread among the guests. The bride stirred faintly on the floor, her lips forming a whisper only I could hear. "They know now." My stomach turned cold. The truth hadn't just arrived. It had walked straight through those doors, ready to tear open every wound I had spent years burying. It feels strange now, looking back at the weeks before the wedding. How ordinary everything seemed on the surface, and how underneath the ground was already cracking. If I'd had the courage to listen to my gut then, maybe that scene at the altar would never have happened. Maybe my son wouldn't have looked at me with those pleading eyes, begging me to say something I couldn't. The first time I sensed something was off with Claire, the bride. was at a Sunday dinner, 2 months before the wedding. Daniel had just finished telling some story about his firehouse crew, his voice full of pride, the way it always was when he spoke about saving lives. Claire sat across the table, her fork untouched, her smile stiff like it had been pinned in place. She laughed at the right moments, said all the things a fiancé should say, but her eyes were somewhere else entirely. After dessert, I caught her in the kitchen. She was rinsing her plate, water splashing noisily against porcelain. I stepped beside her, reached for a towel, and asked softly, "Are you happy, Claire?" "Truly happy?" She froze, just for a second. Then she gave me a smile so practiced it almost broke my heart. "Of course," she said too quickly. "Just nerves." "You know how weddings are," I wanted to believe her. I wanted to nod, wrap her in the comfort of reassurance, and tell her nerves were normal. But something in the way her shoulders sagged, in the way her knuckles whitened against the dish, told me there was more. I didn't press. I should have pressed. Over the following weeks, there were more moments like that. Small, almost forgettable glimpses of unease. Claire leaving the room when certain relatives came around, her abrupt silences whenever Daniel spoke about the future, the way she avoided mirrors when trying on her dress at the final fitting. It wasn't just jitters. It was something heavier, darker, something she was trying desperately to hold inside. I remember lying awake at night, listening to the old house creak and shift around me, my mind replaying every look and half-swallowed word. I thought of Daniel, my boy, who always wanted to fix everything, who had spent his life running into burning buildings, who believed love was strong enough to douse any flame. He adored Claire. He trusted her with a blind devotion I both envied and feared. But me? I wasn't so easily convinced. I had lived long enough to recognize the language of secrets, and Claire was fluent in it. It stirred memories I had tried hard to bury, memories of my own marriage, the quiet betrayals that never made it to daylight, times when silence had seemed like the only option, when speaking out might have destroyed everything. I told myself I was wiser now, that I had learned from those mistakes. But when faced with Claire's haunted expression, I found myself doing the same thing I'd done decades ago, keeping my mouth shut. The irony wasn't lost on me. One night, about a week before the wedding, I stopped by Daniel's apartment to drop off some homemade flan. Claire answered the door, barefoot, hair pulled into a messy bun. For once, she looked less like the polished bride-to-be and more like a scared young woman. Her eyes darted past me down the hallway like she was expecting someone or avoiding someone. "Daniel's at the station," she said quickly, almost defensively. "I know," I replied, holding out the dish. "This is for you." Her hands trembled as she took it. She tried to say thank you, but her lips quivered, and instead of closing the door, she whispered, "You should tell him." Before it's too late, my heart nearly stopped. "Tell him what?" I asked. She blinked, her face tightening, and shook her head. "Forget it. I didn't mean anything." Then she shut the door so gently it felt like she was afraid of the sound. I stood there in the hallway clutching my empty dish towel, feeling like I'd just brushed against the edge of something dangerous. I didn't tell Daniel. I convinced myself it was stress talking, that she was overwhelmed by wedding plans, that she would work through it. I held on to that excuse like a lifeline because the alternative, that my son was marrying into a nightmare, was too heavy to face. But deep down, I knew. Every instinct in me screamed that truth was clawing its way to the surface, whether I was ready or not. And still, I stayed silent. In the days leading up to the wedding, the unease became impossible to ignore. It wasn't one big revelation, not yet. It was a string of small things, each one tugging at me until the weight of them was heavier than any bouquet or bridal gown could hide. There was the rehearsal dinner, for instance. The country club had set out its best china. The chandeliers gleamed like frozen fireworks, and everyone laughed too loudly, drank too freely. Daniel beamed as he toasted to a lifetime of love and loyalty. But when I glanced across the table, I caught Claire staring at her wine glass like it contained a message only she could read. At one point, her maid of honor leaned in, whispering something that made Claire's face drain of color. She excused herself, muttering about the restroom, but I watched her through the glass doors as she stepped outside instead, pacing under the parking lot lights, rubbing her arms as though the night air carried more than just a chill. I followed her out quietly, my heels clicking against the stone path. "Claire," I called softly. She flinched, spinning around like I'd caught her in some forbidden act. "Oh, it's just you." "Are you all right?" I asked. "You look rattled." Her smile was paper thin, just overwhelmed. Too many people, too many expectations. She wasn't wrong. Weddings had a way of turning joy into theater, but her eyes, red-rimmed, watery, told a story that didn't fit her words. "You know," I said gently, "if something's wrong, it's better to speak up before the ceremony, not after." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. For 1 second, I thought she might tell me. Then she straightened, smoothing the fabric of her dress, and replied, "Nothing's wrong. I just need some air I didn't press. Again." The following day, I stopped by the florist to pick up extra centerpieces for the reception. The shop owner, a chatty woman with sharp eyes, asked if everything was ready. When I mentioned Daniel and Claire's names, she hesitated. Just a flicker, like a shadow crossing her face. "You're Daniel's mother?" she asked. "Yes." Her lips pursed as though she wanted to say something more, but then she shook her head. "Lovely couple. Wishing them happiness." The words were polite, but her tone was flat, almost forced. I left with an armful of lilies and a stomach full of unease. Later that evening, I found Claire in the bridal suite at the hotel, surrounded by satin and sequins. She sat before the mirror in her robe, but she wasn't admiring herself. She was staring past her reflection, into some place I couldn't see. "Everything all right?" I asked, stepping inside. She jumped, quickly dabbing at her eyes. "Fine. Just tired." Her phone buzzed on the vanity, and she snatched it up before I could glimpse the screen. Her hands shook as she typed, and then she shoved it deep into the pocket of her robe. I recognized that behavior. Secrets. I'd lived alongside them before, with my own husband, his late nights at business meetings, his evasive answers that eventually unraveled into truths I'd never asked for but still had to bear. That same tension now radiated off Claire. "Claire," I said carefully, "whatever you're holding on to, it won't disappear when you put on that gown tomorrow. If it's heavy now, it'll crush you later." Her lips trembled. For a second, her eyes brimmed with tears, but then she shook her head, forcing another practiced smile. "I'll be fine. Tomorrow will be beautiful." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of her trembling hands. I couldn't ignore the way she flinched when the florist spoke her name, or how she whispered with her maid of honor like a woman planning an escape. I thought of Daniel, how he'd looked at her during the rehearsal dinner, love glowing in his eyes, completely blind to the shadows clinging to her. I wanted to protect him. I wanted to stand between him and whatever storm was brewing. And yet, once again, I stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't my place, that he was a grown man making his own choices. But deep down, I knew my silence wasn't about respect. It was about fear. Fear of what the truth might cost us all. If I had spoken then, maybe the wedding would have ended differently. Maybe Claire wouldn't have collapsed on the altar. Maybe those church doors wouldn't have opened to a truth none of us were ready to face. But instead, I did what I always did. I folded my doubts neatly inside me, like a secret letter no one would ever read. If anyone asks me later why I stayed quiet, I doubt I'll ever be able to give a clean answer. Silence is rarely a single choice. It's 1,000 tiny ones, and mine had been accumulating long before my son ever met Claire. I grew up in a house where silence was survival. My father carried his temper like a loaded gun. My mother, a woman of few words, learned to walk lightly, to nod and smile, to hold her tongue even when her eyes screamed otherwise. She used to whisper to me at night, "Sometimes the truth costs more than the lie." I hated that lesson, but somewhere along the way I absorbed it into my bones. My marriage didn't change it. Daniel's father, God rest him, wasn't a cruel man, but he was careless with honesty. He made promises that dissolved like sugar in water. He was the kind who swore he'd quit drinking after one last night, who told me every delay at work was just overtime, who convinced me my suspicion was paranoia. I swallowed it all because confrontation felt like tearing the fabric of our family apart. I told myself silence was protection, that it kept Daniel safe from seeing his father's flaws, that it gave him the kind of childhood where birthdays still had balloons and Christmas mornings still glittered with wrapping paper. But the truth is, my silence was also cowardice. Every time I bit my tongue, I traded a little piece of myself for the illusion of peace. And now, sitting in the days before Daniel's wedding, I could feel that same cowardice settling around me like an old shawl. Claire's haunted eyes, her trembling hands, the whispered warnings she seemed too afraid to say out loud, they pressed against me, and I pressed back with silence. I told myself it wasn't my place. Daniel was an adult, 29 years old, a man with a career, a man who ran into burning houses without hesitation. Who was I to interfere with his choice of wife? Who was I to plant doubts in his heart on the eve of the biggest decision of his life? But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of losing him, afraid of being the villain in his love story, afraid of what might happen if the truth, whatever it was, came to light. One night, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Claire again. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from a double shift, and Claire was helping me put away dishes. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes every sound magnify. She dried a plate, set it down, and whispered so softly I almost missed it. "I don't deserve him." I froze. "What did you say?" She shook her head quickly, forcing a smile. "Nothing, just nerves." But her eyes betrayed her. They brimmed with something heavier than nerves, something closer to shame. I wanted to grab her shoulders, to shake the truth out of her. Instead, I placed the dish towel down and said the safest thing I could. "Daniel loves you. That's what matters." She nodded, lips pressed tight. And in that moment, I realized I had done it again, chosen the easier sentence over the harder question. That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun shadows across the walls. I thought about all the times silence had spared me and all the times it had betrayed me. I thought about the day I found out my husband had been borrowing money behind my back, leaving us one paycheck from losing the house. I thought about the humiliation of standing in front of the bank manager, pretending I'd known all along. My silence hadn't protected me then. It had only delayed the explosion. And yet, here I was, repeating the cycle. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, the weight of a mother's silence. It wasn't just mine anymore. It was Claire's, too. Whatever truth she was hiding, I was complicit in keeping it buried. In the quiet of that night, I promised myself something. If the truth came knocking, I would open the door. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it cost, I didn't know then that the door would open on its own, that it would swing wide in the middle of my son's wedding, under stained glass and watchful eyes, with Claire collapsing at the altar and a figure stepping into the light. But I should have known. Silence never holds forever. The week before the wedding was a blur of errands. Dress fittings, last-minute calls to the caterer, flower arrangements arriving late and wilting in the summer heat. Everyone was frantic in their own way, but underneath it all, I felt something heavier. Like an old bruise pressed again and again, a dull ache reminding me something wasn't right. That ache sharpened the day I stumbled onto the first real piece of evidence. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had stopped by Daniel's apartment to drop off cufflinks his late father once wore. Claire was there, alone, folding programs at the dining table. Her phone buzzed on the counter, screen lighting up with a message. She didn't notice. She had earbuds in, music humming faintly. I shouldn't have looked, but my eyes went there instinctively. The message read, "I'll be there. Don't back out now." No name, just a number. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The words carried a kind of urgency that didn't sound like anything innocent. Not like a bridesmaid checking in, not like a wedding planner confirming details. It felt like a command, a threat disguised as encouragement. Before I could study it further, Claire snatched the phone up. She must have sensed me looking because her cheeks flushed crimson. "Spam," she muttered, shoving it into her pocket. "You know how numbers hound you when they think you're planning a wedding." I wanted to press, but Daniel came through the door just then, carrying takeout. He kissed her cheek, called her future Mrs. Carter, and for a second, her smile almost seemed real. I swallowed my suspicion and stayed silent, but my unease grew roots. 2 days later, I drove out to the venue to check on the seating charts. While waiting in the lobby, I struck up small talk with the event coordinator. She mentioned she'd had a hard time finalizing things because the bride's special request kept changing. "What special request?" I asked. The coordinator hesitated. She wanted to make sure the side doors were unlocked during the ceremony. Unusual, but she insisted. Said someone important might arrive late. I felt my stomach turn. Weddings are built on tradition. Closed doors, all eyes on the bride. This wasn't nerves. This was preparation. That night, I went through my keepsake box, the one where I kept letters, receipts, odds and ends I couldn't throw away. Among the clutter was an old photograph of Daniel at 12, beaming after a baseball game, his father's arms slung proudly around him. I stared at it, wondering what kind of marriage I'd modeled for him. One where silence protected appearances, one where secrets fermented until they soured everything. I promised myself then, if I saw one more sign, I'd speak. The final sign came sooner than I expected. On Friday, just 2 days before the wedding, I returned home late from the bakery. My kitchen smelled of flour and cinnamon, the air thick from hours of baking. On the counter sat an envelope I didn't recognize, slid under the door while I was gone. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Claire standing in front of a motel on the edge of town, her arms crossed tight, speaking to a man whose face I couldn't fully see. He was turned away, caught mid-gesture, but something about the height, the slope of his shoulders, felt hauntingly familiar. On the back of the photo, in thick black ink, were 3 words, "Ask her now." I dropped into a chair, the picture trembling in my hand. My heart pounded with recognition I couldn't yet place. Whoever had left it knew me well enough to know where I lived, knew enough to warn me or taunt me. I should have taken it to Daniel. I should have said, "Look at this. Look at the messages. Look at the unlocked doors." But instead, I tucked the photo into my purse, next to my wallet, carrying the weight of it like a hidden stone. I told myself the timing was wrong. I told myself Daniel deserved peace on his wedding day. But the truth? I was scared. Scared of shattering his joy, scared of confirming the dread that had been clawing at me for weeks. So I stayed quiet. Again. And by choosing silence, I became complicit in what was coming. The morning of the wedding rose bright and merciless, sunlight spilling across my kitchen table where the bouquets waited in glass vases, white roses soft as breath, their petals already beginning to curl at the edges. I touched one gently and thought, beauty never lasts as long as it promises to. Daniel came by just after sunrise, his tie crooked, his face lit with nervous excitement. He hugged me like he was still a boy, his arms heavy and clumsy, and whispered, "Can you believe today's the day?" I smiled, the way mothers do, with more warmth than certainty. "Yes, sweetheart, today's the day." But beneath my smile, my stomach churned. The house was full of motion, cousins spilling through the door with casseroles, my sister-in-law ironing Daniel's shirt, neighbors dropping off folding chairs we wouldn't use. Laughter and chatter swelled around me, but I felt like I was moving through glass, separate from all of it. I kept glancing at my purse where the photograph still hid. Its weight pressed against me with every step, a constant reminder of the choice I hadn't made. By late morning, we arrived at the church. It was an old building, the kind with wooden pews that creaked when you shifted your weight and stained glass that threw shards of red and blue across the floor. Candles flickered at the altar, the smell of wax mingling with lilies. Guests began to arrive in waves. Old friends, firehouse buddies slapping Daniel's back, relatives I hadn't seen since funerals. Everyone wore their best. Everyone wore their smiles. It was the kind of gathering that should have felt safe, but my chest was tight with a dread I couldn't shake. I took my seat near the front, smoothing the folds of my dress, and tried to steady my breathing. The bridesmaids bustled in, whispering, laughing a little too loud, the way young women do when they're covering nerves with noise. The maid of honor glanced at me once, her smile thin, her eyes unreadable, and then Claire entered. The music shifted, the organ swelled, and she stepped into the doorway in her gown. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. The lace clung to her like it had been stitched from moonlight. The veil, soft as smoke over her face, gasps of admiration rippled through the pews. I wanted to feel pride, relief, something simple. But all I saw was the way her hands gripped the bouquet so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her steps were steady but stiff, like every inch forward cost her more than she had to give. Daniel's eyes lit up when he saw her. Pure, unguarded joy. He mouthed, "I love you." And for a fleeting second, she smiled back, a fragile smile gone almost before it bloomed. The pastor's voice began, deep and reassuring, guiding them through the ceremony. The words rose and fell in rhythm, vows, promises, blessings. I tried to let the cadence wash over me, to lose myself in tradition, but my gaze kept snagging on Claire. Her shoulders trembled beneath the veil. Twice she glanced at the side doors, the ones she had insisted stay unlocked. Each time, a flicker of panic crossed her face before she smoothed it away. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe no one else wanted to. I folded my hands in my lap, nails digging crescents into my palms, and told myself to stay calm. Just make it through the ceremony. Just let Daniel have this day. The pastor asked Daniel to repeat his vows, and he did, voice thick with emotion. He promised love, loyalty, faith. His hands were steady as he held hers. Then it was Claire's turn. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, her bouquet trembling in her grip. Guests shifted, murmurs starting like a restless wind. I caught her eyes through the veil. For one brief, searing moment, I saw everything she'd been holding back. Fear, shame, desperation. And I knew. The silence we had both carried was about to shatter. At first, I thought Claire had simply lost her breath. The way her chest rose and fell, shallow and rapid, like a woman trying to breathe through a paper bag. The pastor leaned closer, murmuring encouragement, urging her to continue. But her lips only trembled, her voice refusing to form the words. Daniel gave her hand a squeeze, whispering, "It's okay. Just take your time." His voice was soft, tender, but it only seemed to make her flinch harder. And then, like a bowstring snapping, she dropped the bouquet. It tumbled down the steps of the altar, white roses scattering like broken teeth. Gasps rippled through the pews. Her fingers went to her veil, clutching it as though it were choking her. In one violent motion, she tore it off and flung it aside. Her hair spilled loose, damp against her temples, her face pale as porcelain but streaked with sweat. Her eyes locked on me. The room tilted, sound distorting into a dull roar. For a moment, I wasn't in that church. I was back in my kitchen weeks earlier hearing her whisper, "I don't deserve him," seeing the photograph slid under my door, staring at the message on her phone. Don't back out now. All of it converged in her gaze, sharp as a blade aimed directly at me. Tell them, she screamed, her voice cracking, but clear enough to echo off the rafters. Tell them the truth. Every head turned toward me. Dozens of eyes bore into my skin, a collective demand I wasn't prepared for. The whispers began, jagged and sharp. What truth? What's she talking about? Daniel looked at me like a drowning man reaching for a rope. Confusion, fear, betrayal, all tangled in his expression. His lips moved soundlessly. Mom? My throat closed. I opened my mouth, but the words turned to dust on my tongue. Silence pressed against me like a vice. Claire staggered back, her chest heaving, her arms trembling as though she were holding up an invisible weight. You know, she cried, jabbing a finger at me, her voice breaking. You've always known. The pastor raised his hands, calling for calm, but it was useless. The sanctuary had dissolved into chaos. Guests rose from their pews, craning for a better view. Murmurs swelled into a current of speculation. Daniel's voice finally broke through, rough and desperate. What is she talking about, Mom? What truth? I couldn't answer. My lips parted, but nothing came out. Only the silence I had carried for too long, heavy and damning. Claire's knees buckled. She let out a choked sob and collapsed onto the altar steps. The maid of honor rushed forward, catching her head before it struck the floor. Cries rose from the pews. Someone shouted for a doctor, another for water. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her, panic twisting his features. Claire! Stay with me. His hands fluttered helplessly over her, not knowing where to touch, how to help. I remained seated, frozen. My heart thundered against my ribs, every beat a scream inside my chest. Do something, I told myself, say something, tell him before it's too late. But I didn't move. And then, the doors. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church groaned open. The hinges screeched against the hush that had fallen after Claire collapsed. Sunlight poured through, cutting a golden path across the aisle. A figure stood silhouetted there, tall, familiar in a way that turned my blood to ice. Guests twisted in their seats, gasps rising like a wave. I heard someone whisper, "It can't be." Another voice choked, "My God, it's him." Daniel looked up from where he knelt, confusion giving way to shock. His gaze darted between me, the bride trembling on the floor and the figure now stepping into the light. My own breath caught. My secrets, the ones I had pressed so deep into silence, were no longer mine to hold. The truth had walked in, and there was no turning it away. The moment the doors opened, the air shifted. It was as if the church itself drew a breath and then forgot how to exhale. The sunlight framed the figure in the doorway, casting long shadows across the aisle. Every head turned, every whisper sharpened into silence. Claire's body jerked upright as though pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes widened, and she let out a strangled cry. "No," she whispered, her voice ragged. "Not here. Not like this." Daniel tried to hold her steady, but she wrenched free, scrambling backward on the altar steps until her gown tangled around her legs. Her trembling hands reached toward me, then toward the doorway, as though she couldn't decide where the greater danger lay. "Claire, what is going on?" Daniel shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "Who is that?" But she couldn't answer. Her chest heaved, her lips moved, and no sound came out. Then her body went slack, and she collapsed again, her head striking the wooden floor with a sickening thud. Gasps tore through the crowd. The maid of honor screamed. The pastor called for someone to dial 911. Guests surged forward, some rushing to help, others retreating in fear as if they might catch whatever had brought her down. I stayed seated, rooted to the pew like my body had turned to stone. My eyes were fixed on the figure moving slowly up the aisle, each step deliberate, echoing against the marble floor. My pulse thundered in my ears. Daniel hovered helplessly over his bride, torn between trying to revive her and confronting the stranger. His face was flushed, veins pulsing in his neck. "Mom!" he cried, his eyes wild as he looked at me. "Do you know him? Do you know what this is?" My mouth went dry. My hands trembled in my lap. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck like stones in my throat. The figure came closer, and recognition spread through the guests like fire leaping from pew to pew. I heard fragments of murmurs. I thought he was gone. After all these years. And it can't be true. By the time he reached the front, the tension was unbearable. Claire lay unconscious. Daniel knelt torn between love and fury, and I sat there, the silence around me louder than any scream. The man, his face weathered but unmistakable, stopped at the altar. His eyes swept across the congregation, then landed squarely on me. "You should have told them," he said, his voice steady, carrying easily across the church. "All these years, and you let it rot in silence." The words struck me like blows. My lungs clenched. This was it. The truth I had carried, the secret I had convinced myself I could bury forever. Gasps erupted from the pews. People leaned toward one another, speculation rippling through the air. Daniel's head whipped back toward me, his eyes filled with betrayal I had never seen on his face before. "Mom?" His voice cracked like glass. "What is he talking about?" What truth? I wanted to reach for him, to pull him into my arms the way I had when he was a boy with scraped knees, when my love alone could heal his wounds. But this wound was different. This was one I had inflicted by saying nothing. I stood slowly, my knees trembling beneath me. The church was spinning, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down, waiting for me to explain, to confess, to untangle years of silence in a single breath. But before I could speak, Claire stirred. She groaned, pushing herself up with trembling arms, her veil lying crumpled on the floor beside her. Her eyes flicked between me, Daniel, and the man standing at the altar. "They know now," she whispered hoarsely. "They finally know." Daniel reached for her, but she shoved his hand away, her body shaking with fury. She pointed at me, her face streaked with sweat and tears. "She knew all along. Ask her, Daniel. Ask your mother what she's been hiding." The room erupted again. Gasps, whispers, shouts. The pastor tried in vain to restore order. His voice drowned beneath the tide of chaos. And me? I stood in the middle of it all, silent as ever, with the truth standing flesh and blood at the altar, daring me to finally open my mouth. The church doors had already closed behind him, shutting out the summer light, leaving us all caught in the heavy stillness of what his presence meant. He stood there, tall but worn, his suit wrinkled, his face lined with years I couldn't erase. And yet, even under the shadows, I knew him instantly, because you never forget the face of the man you once loved and betrayed. "Michael," I whispered, the name catching in my throat like glass. The sound carried farther than I intended. A ripple of recognition tore through the guests. Heads turned, mouths opened. A neighbor behind me gasped, "But Michael Carter's dead." Dead. That's what everyone believed. That's what I let them believe. Daniel's head whipped toward me, his face draining of color. "What did she just say?" he demanded, pointing at the man who now stood just steps away from his unconscious bride. "Mom, who is he?" My heart stuttered. I wanted to hold his gaze, to be steady, but the truth was boiling to the surface whether I was ready or not. Michael's voice, calm but cutting, filled the church. "I'm his father." The room exploded. Gasps, shouts. The pastor dropped his Bible, the thud echoing like a gavel. A woman fainted in the back pew. The bridesmaids clutched one another, eyes wide with horror, and Daniel, my son, my sweet boy, stared at me with a look that hollowed me out. "My father?" His voice cracked. "My father is dead. You told me." "I know," I whispered, my throat raw. "Daniel, But Michael cut across me. "She lied to you. Lied to all of you. She built your life on it." Claire stirred then, her body trembling as she forced herself upright. Her veil was gone, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes burned with clarity. She pointed at me, her fingers shaking. She knew, she spat, all this time. She let me walk into this marriage without saying a word. Daniel turned back to her, his voice frantic. "What are you talking about?" "Claire, what's happening?" She looked at him, her face breaking, and then at Michael. "Because the man standing there, the one she never told you about, he isn't just your father." Her voice cracked on the next words. "He's my father, too." The church fell into stunned silence, the kind that makes your own heartbeat sound deafening. Daniel staggered back like he'd been struck. His mouth opened, closed, no sound coming out. He looked at me, desperate, pleading for this to be some twisted mistake. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, "tell me it's not true." But I couldn't. My legs trembled as I rose from the pew. The truth spilled from me in fragments, each word heavier than the last. Michael wasn't dead. He left. He left when you were just a baby, Daniel, and my voice faltered. I told everyone he had died. I thought it was the only way to protect you, to protect us. He built another life. He had another family, and Claire... My voice broke completely. Claire is his daughter. The words rang out in the sanctuary like a curse. Chaos erupted. Guests shouted, covering their mouths, clutching their children. The pastor stumbled back, muttering prayers under his breath. The maid of honor sobbed openly, gripping Claire's shoulders. Daniel's face went blank, his body rigid. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his voice low and dangerous, "that the woman I just married is my half-sister." Claire's sobs tore through the church. "I didn't know. Not until months ago. She jabbed a finger toward Michael. "He showed up. He told me everything. I begged her." She swung toward me, fury and despair mingling in her voice. "I begged her to tell you the truth before today." My knees buckled, and I clutched the back of the pew to steady myself. "I couldn't," I whispered. "Daniel, I couldn't break you like that." His face twisted in anguish. "You think this isn't broken? You think standing here at this altar, finding out my wife is my sister, isn't the worst kind of broken?" Michael stepped forward then, his shadow falling over the altar. His eyes were sharp, unapologetic. "I told her this day would come. Secrets don't stay buried forever, and for the first time in my life, I wished the earth would swallow me whole." The church smelled of roses and sweat and fear. The air was so thick with whispers it felt like a hive ready to swarm. And in the middle of it all, I stood, caught between the man I had once loved, the son I'd raised on lies, and the young woman whose world was collapsing in front of me. Daniel's face was ghost pale, his jaw clenched tight. "Start talking," he growled, his voice shaking with rage. "Somebody, anybody, make this make sense." Michael cleared his throat, his eyes sweeping the congregation. "It's true. I never died. I left. I walked away from her." He nodded toward me, and from Daniel. I was young, selfish, chasing something I thought I deserved. Another woman. Another chance. His gaze flicked briefly to Claire, and his voice dropped. "Another family." Claire's body trembled. Her veil crumpled at her feet like shed skin. "I grew up knowing him as my father. That's all. He was there for me in ways he wasn't for you." Her eyes darted toward Daniel, raw with shame. "I didn't know we were connected until he told me. Not until I was already in love with you." Daniel staggered back, his hands running through his hair, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "So you mean to tell me," he rasped, "that the woman I just vowed my life to, the woman I've been sharing my bed with, is my sister?" Claire broke then, her sobs racking her frame. "I didn't want it to happen like this. I tried. I begged your mother." Her voice cracked. "I begged her to tell you before it was too late." The congregation buzzed with horrified murmurs, voices overlapping. This is madness. They didn't know. How could the mother keep this secret? Daniel's head snapped toward me, his eyes blazing. You knew. His voice wasn't a question. It was a verdict. You knew all along. My throat tightened. My hands twisted together until my knuckles ached. I thought. My voice was a whisper, barely carrying. I thought it would be kinder if you never knew. If I buried Michael, you'd never have to carry the stain of what he did. I wanted to protect you. Protect me? Daniel's laugh was harsh, hollow. You didn't protect me. You damned me. You left me blind to the truth. And now look where I am. Look what you let me do. Every word pierced deeper than any knife. I wanted to reach for him, to beg forgiveness, but his shoulders stiffened, his eyes like stone. Michael stepped closer to the altar, his presence looming. I told her years ago this secret would surface. She thought silence could hold it down forever, but silence rots and eventually it bursts wide open. His eyes bored into mine. This is your doing. I wanted to scream back at him, to remind him he was the one who left, the one who built a second family while I scraped together a life for Daniel. But the truth lodged heavy in my chest. He was right. My silence had done its own kind of damage, just as cruel in its way as his abandonment. Claire clutched at Daniel's sleeve, tears streaming. Please, Daniel, please believe me. I didn't know until months ago. I thought I was just marrying the man I loved. Daniel ripped his arm away, his voice raw. And what am I supposed to do with that? What am I supposed to do with the fact that the woman I love is my blood? The pastor tried to intervene, his voice quavering. Perhaps this is not the place. But Daniel cut him off with a roar. This is the place. This is the altar where I was just lied to, where my life was just destroyed. His voice cracked, his body trembling. And it was destroyed by the two people I should have been able to trust most. My father, who walked out, and my mother, who stayed, but kept the truth buried. The sanctuary rang with silence after his words, a silence so sharp it felt like glass shattering. I lowered my eyes, unable to meet his. For all my justifications, all my reasons, I had no defense against the devastation in his voice. In that moment, I understood. The truth hadn't just walked in through the church doors. It had ripped the entire foundation of my family out from under us. And nothing, not time, not prayer, not my love as a mother, could put it back the way it was. The altar, once dressed in flowers and satin, now looked like a crime scene. Roses trampled underfoot, the veil abandoned, torn. Claire crumpled on the floor, clutching her chest. Daniel looming above her, every muscle trembling with rage and grief. And me, his mother, standing useless, caught in the crossfire of my own silence. "Say it again," Daniel rasped, his voice raw. He stared at me as if he could burn the truth into my skin. Tell me that you knew." I opened my mouth, but nothing came. My silence was answer enough. His face twisted, as if the boy I had raised, the man in his fire chief's uniform, had evaporated, leaving only a stranger. 40 years you've lived in this town. 40 years of people believing my father was dead, and the whole time you knew he was out there. You let me grow up without him. You let me stand here today and... His voice broke, a jagged sob splitting through. "You let me marry my sister." Claire whimpered, reaching for him. "Daniel, please." But he recoiled like her touch burned. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't you dare." She pulled her hands back, her sobs shaking her shoulders. "I didn't know until he told me." She gestured toward Michael, her voice shrill with desperation. "I begged her to stop it. I begged her to tell you. I thought she would." The congregation was no longer even pretending to be discreet. Gasps, murmurs, hands clamped over mouths. Someone muttered, "This is ungodly." Another whispered, "Poor boy, poor girl." Michael stood apart, his arms folded, his expression hard. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This circus helps no one. What's done is done." Daniel spun on him, his voice a roar. "What's done is you! You walked out, you left her to lie for you, and now look where we are. You don't get to stand there and play the wise man. You are the reason I've been lied to my whole life." Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I gave her a chance to tell you." She chose not to. "Don't lay this at my feet." His words were gasoline. Daniel's fists clenched. "You're both poison," he spat. He pointed at Michael. "For abandoning us, and you—" His eyes cut into me. "For lying to me, for thinking your silence could save me. You've both destroyed everything." The weight of his words pressed into me until I thought my chest might cave in. My son, the boy whose scraped knees I kissed, whose nightmares I calmed, whose future I carried in my heart, I had become his betrayer. Claire's voice broke through, sharp and frantic. "We can fix this. We can annul it. We can walk away." Daniel's laugh was hollow, cracked. "Walk away? Walk away from what? The vows I just took at an altar? The wife who's my sister? The mother who's been lying to me my whole life?" He ran a hand through his hair, tugging until his knuckles went white. "There's no walking away. There's no fixing this." He staggered back, his gaze sweeping the church, the faces staring at him like he was a tragedy on display. "All of you, stop staring!" he bellowed, his voice booming off the rafters. "Go home! Go back to your families and thank God they aren't like mine." The pastor murmured for calm, his words falling uselessly. Guests began to rise, some shuffling out, some lingering to watch the collapse. Daniel turned back to us, his eyes blazing with a pain I'd never seen before. "I don't want to see any of you." "Not her." He gestured to Claire, who was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. "Not him." His glare cut into Michael. "And not you, Mom." "Not right now." The final words shredded me. He stormed down the aisle, the echo of his boots striking the floor like a hammer. Guests parted for him, their whispers trailing behind like smoke. The great oak doors slammed shut behind him, rattling the stained glass. The silence that followed was deafening. I sank back into the pew, my body trembling. Around me, the church was unraveling, people whispering, moving, pointing, but inside me, everything was already shattered. The truth hadn't just walked in, it had burned the house down. The church emptied slowly like a battlefield after the fight has ended. Guests shuffled out in clusters, their whispers lingering in the air long after their footsteps faded. Some glanced at me with pity, others with disgust, most with the hollow-eyed thrill of people who knew they'd have a story to tell for the rest of their lives. Claire sat slumped on the altar steps, her gown crumpled around her, mascara streaking her cheeks in crooked rivers. Her maid of honor hovered, murmuring useless comforts, though the girl flinched from every touch. Michael stood off to the side, his presence a shadow over us all, arms folded, eyes sharp as knives, and Daniel was gone. The sound of those oak doors slamming shut still echoed in my chest like a funeral bell. The pastor finally approached me, his Bible tucked under one arm. His voice was low, measured. "Mrs. Carter, perhaps it's best you and your family take this outside. The sanctuary isn't meant for scenes like this." I almost laughed at that. Scenes like this, as if what had just happened was a drama we'd rehearsed, lines delivered on cue. But I only nodded, my throat too raw for words, and rose on trembling legs. Outside, the summer air hit me like a slap. The parking lot was already buzzing with gossip, neighbors whispering, relatives pulling out phones to text the story faster than wildfire. I caught fragments, half-siblings, lied for decades, unthinkable. Claire stumbled out behind me, her veil clutched like a lifeline in her hands. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice ragged, eyes darting wildly. "Where's Daniel?" He has to let me explain, but Daniel wasn't there. His car was gone. The sound of his tires long faded. Michael stepped up beside her, his voice low, almost cold. "He won't want to see you." "Not now," Claire spun on him, fury and grief colliding. "This is your fault." "If you'd told me sooner, if you hadn't waited until I loved him." Her voice cracked. "You ruined me." Michael didn't flinch. "I didn't ruin you." She did. His eyes cut to me like daggers. She let the lie live. The words carved into me deeper than I wanted to admit, because as much as I wanted to deny them, as much as I wanted to scream back that he was the one who abandoned us, the truth was tangled. He had left, yes, but I had chosen silence, and silence had teeth. Claire sank to the curb, her gown spilling into the dirt, her shoulders shaking with sobs. People passed by, staring openly, their pity edged with scandal. I wanted to reach for her, to offer some fragment of comfort, but my arms felt heavy, useless. She wasn't just my son's bride anymore. She was Michael's daughter. She was a mirror of all the choices that had led us here. The police eventually came, not because of violence, but because the whispers of collapse and chaos had spread. They asked questions in hushed voices, making notes in small pads, though their eyes flicked between us with thinly veiled judgment. I gave them the bare minimum, my voice flat, my gaze distant. When they left, Michael lingered. "This isn't over," he told me quietly, his voice carrying more threat than promise. "You've buried too much. And Daniel deserves more than half-truths." I wanted to spit back that he'd forfeited the right to talk about what Daniel deserved the day he walked away. But my voice wouldn't come. Silence again. My old curse. By nightfall, I was back in my kitchen, alone. The bouquets I'd brought home that morning still sat on the table, wilting faster than they should have, their petals browned and curling. I touched one, and it crumbled under my fingers. The phone rang once, twice, then fell silent. I didn't answer. I knew it wouldn't be Daniel. He wouldn't call me. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. I sat there in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and thought about how quickly a life can collapse. 1 minute, you're smoothing your son's tie, telling him he's handsome, watching him beam with the kind of joy you'd die to protect. The next, you're watching him storm out of his own wedding, your lies trailing behind him like smoke. I had told myself silence was mercy, that sparing him the truth was love. But love built on silence was nothing but rot. And now the walls had caved in. The fallout wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, suffocating. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you'll ever hear laughter in your house again. Weeks have passed, though the memory of that day clings to me like smoke that won't wash out of fabric. The wedding that should have been a celebration has become a wound the whole town whispers about. Every trip to the grocery store, every Sunday service, I can feel the eyes on me, some pitying, some judging, all hungry for details. Daniel hasn't moved back home, but he hasn't spoken to me either. The silence between us is heavier than any truth I ever hid. Sometimes I see his car parked outside the firehouse when I drive past, the lights still on late into the night. I imagine him sitting there, staring at his hands, wondering how he'll ever feel clean again. Claire is gone. She left town within days, her belongings packed into a rental car, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. No goodbye, just the shadow of her absence. I can't decide whether to feel anger at her for not fighting harder to stay, or sorrow for the girl who was forced to carry a truth too heavy for her young shoulders. Maybe both. And Michael, he lingers like a storm on the horizon. I've seen him once since the wedding, standing across the street from my bakery, watching through the glass as I arranged loaves on the shelf. He didn't come inside. He didn't wave. He just stood there, reminding me that ghosts never stay buried once they've found a way back. The bakery is busier than ever, though. People come in with wide eyes, pretending to want pastries but really wanting pieces of the story. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Carter?" they ask in gentle tones, the same tones people use when circling gossip. I smile, I box up their bread, I tell them I'm fine, and then I go into the back room, press my flour-dusted hands against the counter, and feel the truth sitting on my chest like a stone. Because here's the truth no one really wants. Silence doesn't protect, it poisons. Every secret I thought I was shielding Daniel from grew in the dark until it burst into the light, tearing us both apart. My mother used to say, sometimes the truth costs more than the lie. But I've learned the opposite is just as real. Sometimes the lie is what robs you of everything. I replay the wedding in my mind more than I care to admit. The bouquet tumbling down the steps, Claire's voice echoing through the sanctuary. Tell them the truth. The heavy doors swinging open, Daniel's eyes as he realized I had betrayed him. Each memory is a thorn I can't pull free. At night, when the house is quiet, I sit by the window and wait for headlights that never appear. I want my son to come home, to slam the door like he used to when he was a teenager, to shout about how unfair the world is. At least then I would hear his voice. At least then I would know there's still something between us. But silence lingers. A different kind now. No longer the silence of secrets, but the silence of distance. And yet, even in the rubble, I search for something to hold on to. Maybe it's the bakery with its ovens that demand attention, its customers who still need their bread. Maybe it's the memory of Daniel as a boy, his hand slipping into mine, trusting me completely. Maybe it's the stubborn hope that one day, when the smoke clears, he'll find his way back to me. Not because I deserve it, but because love sometimes grows again, even in burned soil. The truth walked in that day, and it didn't just collapse a wedding. It collapsed a family. But families, like old houses, sometimes find ways to stand again. Not the same as before, never the same. But standing nonetheless. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand better than most. Silence is never as harmless as it seems. Maybe you've carried your own secrets, tucked them away in the hope they'd never surface. But they do. They always do. So tell me, what city are you hearing my story from tonight? How far has my silence traveled? Share it with me in the comments. Because maybe if my story goes far enough, someone else will choose to speak before it's too late.